Forget the giant turkey legs and roaring fireplaces you see in Hollywood movies. If you walked into a real English tavern in the 11th century, the smell alone would knock you over. Here's the rough, fascinating truth about what people really ate and drank in the Middle Ages and why it was strictly about staying alive. To truly understand what was on the menu in 12th century England, we first have to throw away the modern idea of a restaurant or a pub and step straight into the muddy, smoke-filled reality of the medieval alehouse. In the 11th century, right in the harsh aftermath of the Norman conquest, society was strictly divided, and so were its drinking places. A true tavern was a high-end business that sold imported, expensive wine, serving almost only the French-speaking Norman lords, wealthy merchants, and the highest ranks of the clergy. But for most people, the exhausted peasants, serfs, and laborers, the local place to drink was the alehouse. An alehouse was not even a special building made for business. It was usually just a neighbor's cramped wattle-and-daub cruck house. You knew it was open when the alewife, the woman of the house, who had just finished brewing a fresh, highly perishable batch of drink, shoved an ale stake out her front door. This was a long wooden pole with a bushy evergreen branch tied to the end, telling the village that the drink was ready. Stepping inside, you would be hit right away by a wall of strong smell, stale sweat from men who had been plowing fields since dawn, the sharp bite of wood smoke from the open central hearth, and the heavy yeasty smell of boiling grain, the absolute cornerstone of the medieval diet. And the main reason these alehouses existed at all was ale, but this was nothing like the clear, bubbly golden lagers of today. 12th century ale was basically liquid bread. It was thick, cloudy, high in calories, and completely flat. Because untreated river or well water was often polluted with farm runoff or human waste, it was extremely dangerous to drink. Almost everyone in the village, including toddlers, drank this weak ale from sunrise to sunset just to stay hydrated and keep their energy up. Also, hops had not yet been brought into English brewing. Instead, this early medieval ale was flavored and kept using grute, a bitter local mix of herbs and plants like yarrow, mugwort, and heather. Because it did not have the preserving power of hops, it went bad within days, meaning brewing was a constant, never-ending, and vital job for the women of the village. When it came to solid food in these alehouses, the clear, undisputed champion of the working-class diet was a simple dish called pottage. If a tired laborer slapped a hard-earned silver penny on the rough, worn wooden table, they were not getting a roasted leg of mutton. Pottage was a thick, always simmering stew or porridge that sat in a large cast iron or clay pot over the hearth fire all day long. Its base depended completely on what peasants could grow in their small village plots: boiled oats or barley, heavily filled out with tough, fibrous vegetables like cabbages, leeks, onions, garlic, turnips, and peas. The best thing about pottage was how flexible it was. If the alewife had a good week, or if a customer brought something to trade, the pot might be made richer with a little precious protein to pull in a bigger crowd. However, this almost never meant fresh beef or pork, which were mostly privileges saved for the nobility. Instead, the pottage might be flavored with tough scraps of salted bacon, a bit of dried fish if the village was near the coast, or maybe some scavenged marrow bones to give the broth some badly needed fat. Save some for later. With this steaming bowl of pottage came the other non-negotiable food staple: bread. Refined white wheat bread, known as maunch, was a luxury only the rich could afford. Common people ate coarse, dark, incredibly dense bread called maslin, baked from a rough mix of rye, barley, and sometimes ground dried peas or beans. This bread was heavy, hard on the teeth, and packed with fiber. It was so sturdy that people often used it like a tool. Peasants used thick chunks of maslin to scoop up their pottage, soaking up the tasty broth and softening the bread enough to chew. It was a boring, strongly fibrous diet, but it was absolutely necessary fuel for people who spent their whole lives doing back-breaking manual labor, from the moment the sun rose until it finally set.
Once the heavy wooden door of the alehouse swung shut against the biting English cold, you were hit right away by a wall of pure, unfiltered humanity. In the 11th century, these cramped, smoke-blackened rooms were much more than just a place to grab a cheap drink. They were the absolute center of village life, and the only real safe place from the crushing weight of the feudal system. Because peasants had almost no free time, and their own wattle and daub cruck huts were dark, freezing, and shared with livestock, the alehouse became their living room, their town hall, and their nightly escape. Picture the scene. The air is almost solid with the stinging smell of a central peat or wood fire, the sour tang of spilled ale, and the unwashed bodies of men and women who had spent the last 14 hours hacking at stubborn clay soil. The only light came from the flickering hearth and a few sputtering tallow rushlights, cheap candles made by dipping dried reeds into melted animal fat, which smoked terribly and smelled a lot like burnt meat. In the middle of this attack on the senses, the noise was deafening. There was no quiet sulking in a corner. The room was packed shoulder to shoulder with locals crowded on rough, worn wooden benches, drinking heavily from crude wooden tankards or leather jacks. Ale flowed constantly, but the alewife also served whatever extra supplies she managed to scrounge, forage, or preserve to keep her customers drinking. Alongside the ever-present pottage and rock-hard maslin bread, customers might be lucky enough to buy a hunk of green cheese. This was not moldy. In the 12th century, green simply meant fresh and unaged. Hard-aged cheeses were valuable trade goods saved for lords, so peasants ate the soft, highly perishable curds made from sheep or goat milk, heavily salted to keep it from rotting in the winter. If a local poacher had dared to risk the severe anger of the Norman forest laws, which strictly banned peasants from hunting the king's deer or wild boar under punishment of blinding or mutilation, there might secretly be a tough, stringy rabbit or a few trapped wood pigeons roasting over the flames. Foraging played a huge role in their diet, so the food was often filled out with wild garlic, nettles, watercress, and hazelnuts gathered from the edge of the woods. Every single calorie mattered, and absolutely nothing was ever wasted. But the alehouse was not only about getting enough calories to survive. It was the social beating heart of the peasantry. This was the place where the strict, rigid rules of medieval society loosened their grip a little. It was a place for loud, fire-lit entertainment. Traveling minstrels or storytellers hoping to earn a free bowl of stew might pluck a wooden harp and sing bawdy songs or recite epic poems about old Anglo-Saxon heroes, giving a rare peek at a world beyond their muddy village limits. Gambling was everywhere and fiercely fought over. Men hunched over rough tables playing hazard, a fast, hugely popular dice game introduced by the Normans, or a strategic board game called Nine Men's Morris. First came luck. The stakes were shockingly high for people who owned almost nothing. A bad roll of the bone dice could easily cost a man his iron sickle, his wool tunic, or a desperately needed sack of seed grain. Of course, mixing exhaustion, high-stakes gambling, and gallons of unfiltered ale often led to explosive violence. With no official police force, arguments over a cheated dice roll or a stolen sheep were often settled right there on the dirt floor with fists, wooden stools, or the small eating knives everyone carried on their belts. Yet even with the occasional bloody brawl, the alehouse was the one place where a 12th century peasant could briefly forget the crushing taxes, the brutal labor, and the ever-present threat of starvation, finding short-lived warmth and friendship at the bottom of a wooden cup. However, the loud, fire-lit safe place of the 12th century alehouse could not last forever, and the end of the night always brought these exhausted villagers crashing back into their harsh reality. As the evening went on, and the supply of thick, cloudy ale began to run low, the booming laughter, the clacking of bone dice, and the bawdy songs of traveling minstrels slowly faded into a tired, heavy murmur. The final end of their short freedom was controlled by the sound of the village curfew bell, brought in by the newly settled Norman conquerors to prevent both disastrous accidental fires and secret nighttime rebellions. The curfew literally meant "cover the fire." When that iron bell tolled from the tower of the local stone church, it was a strict legal order that all hearths had to be smothered with ash, and all public gatherings had to stop at once. The night watch, if the village was big enough to have one, would harshly patrol for stragglers. "Time to cover the fire!" Anyone caught wandering the muddy, unpaved lanes after curfew risked a heavy fine from the local sheriff, or much worse, being violently branded as a thief or a dangerous outlaw. So, with bellies stuffed full of heavy oat-based pottage and minds pleasantly numbed by gallons of herb-infused Groot ale, the customers of the alehouse stumbled blindly out into the pitch-black English night. There were no street lamps in the 11th century, only the suffocating total darkness of the medieval countryside and the distant terrifying howling of wolves from the dense, heavily controlled forests around their lonely settlements. They found their way back to their freezing wattle and daub cruck houses by pure memory and moonlight, their leather boots sinking deep into the foul muck